so nice to be here in Italy in this warm weather after a long June in Amsterdam with storms, rains, and dark clouds. So I'm enjoying my time. I'm going to bombard you today with a lot of ideas, code examples, and patterns on NGRX. I hope you're not tired. A short introduction of myself. My name is Ceylan. I'm Google developer expert in web technologies. I'm working as a JavaScript tech lead for Linkit, and via Linkit I help KLM Royal Dutch Airlines for the past 3 years on their engineering and maintenance digitization. And on my free time, I love speaking about technologies that I'm interested in, such as JavaScript, TypeScript, Angular, Ionic, and progressive web apps. And I help local communities like ITNext, GDGNL in Netherlands as a co-organizer. Before start, how many of you use NGRX? Can you raise your hands, please? Almost half of the audience. And how many of you is using NGRX more than 1 year? 2 years? Okay, I have a lot of material for every level. And if you're not into NGRX, maybe this presentation can give you ideas about how it is and how it works. NGRX is a platform. We call it platform because it's a set of libraries. It's a set of clean, well-tested libraries for reactive programming for Angular applications. I'm not going to tell you whether you should use NGRX or when to use, but I rather aim helping you how to use it efficiently if you decide to use it. Some of the libraries, actually all of the libraries, are listed here. NGRX Store is RxJS-powered state management for Angular applications, inspired by Redux. FX is side effect model. Router Store is bindings to connect Angular router to your store. Store DevTools is a store instrumentation that enables a powerful time traveler debugger. An entity is a state adapter for managing record collections. Data joined the family recently. I will talk about it in next slides. It's an extension for simplified entity data management. And Schematics is a scaffolding library for Angular applications using NGRX. I would like to quote some of the ideas and patterns from Mike Ryan's talk. Good action hygiene with NGRX, that's the talk title. Starting with maintaining a good action hygiene. I believe the more we stress it will be better for Angular community. And as you saw in the previous slide, I will get some help from my Pokemon friends, because who doesn't like Pokemons, right? Actions are the foundations of NGRX application, and a good formula to write good actions is using source event format. And the sources of actions can be categorized in 3 different categories. You can categorize them in user events, backend events, and device events. This categorization is important to build up a good action hygiene. You can see a generic way of maintaining action here. At first look, it might look normal to most of you, but I would like to take your attention to these 2 events. It looks like they're from the same source, right? They're all coming from wonton soup. And I chose this example because my wife runs Chinese restaurants, and as a responsible partner, I build websites and mobile applications for the restaurant. So that's why I'm interested in this. So with the wonton soup add one action, it's not clear to me where is it coming from. And a more explicit way of handling exact same action can be seen on the right. By doing this, we can make it clear where is the source of an action to everybody contributing in this project. Not only developers, but also product team can be aware of just scraping the logs of your application. What was the journey of a user following path, starting with the initialization of your application. So with the second example, it's clear to me that the first action was coming from menu page, and the second was coming from soup details page. And as mentioned earlier, you can group them under 3 categories. This is how the example is grouped now, under these 3 categories. As put by Mike in his presentation as well, good actions are actions that you can actually recognize a year later. So when you take a look at your code 1 year later, you should be still able to understand where is the source of this action. This also helps on instrumentation of your store DevTools, so you can just scrape the logs in your store DevTools, or if you collect these logs in a backend storage, you can understand pretty much what was the journey of a user. Use NGRX schematics. We already understood in the morning from Thomas's talk, schematics are quite powerful, and we will use it for NGRX as well. A lot of people complained about boilerplate, and it was the #1 reason for many developers to avoid introducing NGRX into their systems. There was this tweet storm going around in Twitter, and I think even today, you can, if you search for NGRX boilerplate, you can see some tweets. You can deal with boilerplate concern by using NGRX schematics. A good trick on NGRX schematics is to set a default collection for your Angular application. After installing NGRX schematics, you can execute this command to set it as a default schematic for your project. And the NGRX schematics is just an extension of schematics Angular collection. For instance, if you, in your original configuration, you chose using SAS over CSS, you also have to do it by extending NGRX schematics. Just rename schematics Angular to NGRX schematics, put your modifications into this setting. Currently, there is no official style guide for Angular app using NGRX. This can be confusing for beginners using NGRX. There are a lot of confusion where to put files, how to categorize them, how to create folder structure. But schematics is here to help by running these 3 commands. These are 3 simple commands for your next reactive feature. Let's say we are going to build a user feature, and by running these 3 commands, we will be having a new reactive feature coming with a lot of folders and files, also including testbed configurations. So this is the output of those 3 commands. All these files, all these folders are created for us. It has the scaffolding code in it, so you can just start typing your NGRX code in it. Use selectors. I often notice selectors are not used at all in a lot of NGRX applications. They are not just helpful functions to select from store any longer. They have become the essential part of the store API, and they carry along the typings with them. So by using selectors, you don't need to introduce types to your store anymore, and you can help reducing the number of triggered state changes because it also avoids using the right state in your state. And in addition, they help us to refactor our code by keeping selector logic apart from components logic. And if you change the description of your store, you don't need to update every single component anymore. Don't repeat yourself, and by using selectors, you won't be repeating yourself. Otherwise, you will be accessing state slides over and over again in your components. And selectors often should be used as a view model for components. So if you create this separation and put the view model logic onto, delegate this logic to selectors, you will keep your components clean, and it will also prevent you to use dry state. By using selectors, you will start to use small utility functions like filters, reducers, sorters, and more. So these are pure little functions. It's easy to test them, it's easy to reuse them also in your services in other components, not only for NGRX, but throughout your application. You will improve reusability. How many of you heard about memoization? You should start using selectors, especially for performance concerns. Pure selector functions will help you to avoid slicing through the state every time you need a piece of it, and it will eventually save you from repeating yourself. And for the performance benefits it brings, let's have a look at the following code from NGRX selector docs about memoization. Because selectors are pure functions, the last result can be returned when the arguments match without re-invoking your selector function. So you introduce a function, and if the arguments doesn't change for your function, it will return the cached result for that function. This is especially important when dealing with expensive calculations. And by using selectors, you're getting this for free. So if you start using selectors today, you will be getting the benefit of using this performance. Type safety is another reason to use them. As I said shortly earlier, they brings the types from definition of selector. This means when you use selectors in your facade or in your container components, you don't need to introduce store types anymore. So this is an example of not introducing store type, because since this is a dependency injection of Angular, this type was an illusion anyway. So it's not actually the type of the original store, but it's type casting. It's a trick to TypeScript compiler. And by using this, we will also make it clear for a developer that this is nothing. It doesn't represent anything. The actual soups observable type is inherited from the selector itself. By using this get all soups selector, we are getting the type for soups observable. And this is an example of using a selector, slicing out a part of the menu state. You can see I introduced a new filter function. This is how you can improve reusability. I just introduce a filter function, and I use this filter function in my selector, and I can use the same filter function in any other service, in any other component when needed. And this is actually getting the menu state, and out of menu state, it's getting the slice of the state for the soups. It's filtering the soups part of the whole menu. This is how selectors work. They just grab the slice of the whole state, so you just deal with that slice. Selectors are also composable. You can compose multiple selectors, as many as you can. It's very convenient because you can delegate your reusable view model logic to selectors, and then use these selectors in as many components as you wish. In this scenario, this is actually getting the preferred menu. So I'm introducing this function filter menu by soup type and using it here, and it uses these two variables from different part of the state. So it gets the user preferences and it gets the whole menu state and combines those two values, and by using single function, it returns a data where we need. Before moving forward, let's have a look at selector takeaways. Don't pollute the store state with the right state. Use state selectors to create view models. Keep selectors small so they can be reused to compose bigger and more complex selectors. Take advantage of memoization by using selectors, and custom memoize and result memoize when needed. In some cases, you prefer to process data for part of your application store, such as application settings like user config, in user's browser storage, and you need to hydrate it because you want to keep this storage for user. This can be done through meta reducers. Just be careful about serialization when you put a data in your store. Your data must be serializable, not only for the store, but also for hydration, because we are using local storage, which means you cannot put your map or set objects, instances of classes, into your store. An easy way of checking whether your object is serializable or not is combining these two functions against your object and comparing the result with your original object. If it's the same, then it's serializable. And good news, there's a new way to enforce this serialization with a new feature called runtime checks. Runtime checks are introduced with version 8. They are introduced to guide developers to follow NGRX core principles and best practices. NGRX team added 4 runtime checks. They are here to shorten the feedback loop of easy to make mistakes. These check-ins are opt-in, so you don't have to introduce them. But when introduced, you will get this feedback loop for your development. And the one that has an arrow next to it is for assuring that you have a serializable state. I use ngrx store local storage package to process data in local storage. And this is an example of how it's done using a meta reducers. You can use this on your feature store modules as well as root store modules. And this is how meta reducers are declared for feature stores. And we need to adjust views when we introduce NGRX, starting with NGIF and ASYNC pair. You can get advantage of using selectors directly on your view templates with async pipe. This will save you time and effort for worrying about your unsubscription logic, because when you deal with observables, if you subscribe to them in your components, then you need to unsubscribe to avoid memory leaks. By using async pipe and avoid subscription in component level, we will leave this logic to Angular to unsubscribe as well. And by enabling change detection strategy to on push, you can produce more performance benefits to your view layer. Reducers can get quite complex in NGIF applications, and one can easily find herself in a situation what we call spread hell. So this is the spread hell. It doesn't look so nice, right? This is an example code from a reducer that we have worked on more than a year ago. The stored data represents this paradigm called spread hell. So every time you want to update a property or a value which is deep down under this object tree, you need to deal with this spread, because you need to provide not mutated version of the state. And in order to do that, you're using object spreads. One of the ways of dealing with the spread hell is to enforce immutability with an immutability library, such as immer. Why immer? It's easy to use. You don't have to learn any new API on concept. It's just good old objects and arrays of JavaScript. Immer can transform mutable operations that you make into immutable actions. Here's an example how it's transformed, the previous example transformed into this one. In this example, we import produce function from immer, and by wrapping our reducer function with produce, we can mutate our object as we wish. For instance, we assign a value, this is a mutation. We assign another value to object property, this is another mutation, and we delete an object. So it really doesn't look nice if you don't have this secure wrapper of produce. So if you feel more comfortable by doing things in mutable way, you can introduce produce and you don't worry about it anymore. Another way of dealing with spread hell is by introducing NGRX entity library. NGRX team works hard on reducing the boilerplate issue. That's one of the reasons of building such a library, but it's not the only one. You possibly deal with a lot of collections in your application, and maintaining your stored data with large and complex collection of entities can be really headache. Not to mention that boilerplate code it generates. And this is how your spread hell can transform into an entity heaven. So that this produces the same effect. What we are doing, we are creating a new entity adapter. An entity adapter brings us a lot of CRUD methods. We are going to take a look at them. And over entity adapter, I just call update1 and provide the same data object and provide the ID to the ID of adapter. Let's talk further about entity. It uses entity state. This is an interface of the entity state, and there are a couple of reasons for maintaining a dictionary of entities and a list of IDs in your entity state. So in order to keep your collection sorted along other items in your dictionary, you need to have a sorted object, which is array in this case. Arrays are sorted, but dictionaries are not. Arrays can keep the order of our collection just by using IDs. And entities is a dictionary because using dictionary is much more performant compared to searching through an array. So if you directly access to a property of a dictionary, you will get it quite fast compared to filtering through your array. And this is how entity adapter is built. You just call create entity adapter, and this is an optional sorter. You can introduce your own sorter function, and it will create this IDs array based on this function. This is our function now, and we introduce this user interface and providing this user interface for our entity adapter. And our user adapter now includes CRUD methods like upsert many. There are more methods like add many, add all, remove one, remove many, remove all, update one, update many, update upsert one, upsert many. So you can check the documentation for each one of them and use it accordingly for handling your collections. An entity library doesn't only provide this good way of handling with large collections, it also provides us default selectors. So we already know how selectors are important, and we don't need to build them anymore. Entity adapter just provides these default selectors for us, and if you want to compose them to create your additional selectors, you can start composing them as well. You may never face boilerplate issue with ngrx-data. ngrx-data is a new library in the platform. More than a year ago, John Papa sent this tweet. They started with Ward Bell introducing a third-party library called ngrx-data. And with the version 8 of NGRX, this became the first-party library. And this started with the concern of what can go wrong with code generation, because we can generate entities, right? We have the entity adapter. We can create selectors, we can create collections, we can create adapters, we can introduce reducers, actions. But for really large applications, meaning that you might introduce maybe 100 entity models. For each 100 entity models, you need to introduce actions, reducers, effects, and handling them and maintaining them can be really hard job for large applications. So this library is built with the mindset of having a single objective to simplify management of entity data. It's an abstraction of reducers, actions, effects, selectors, and HTTP data services. So you don't need to introduce any of them. Almost anything is customizable at a single entity type configuration. And NGX data library is good for querying, caching, and saving entity data as well. You might want to check it out. It can be really handy if you deal with so many entities in your application. And optimistic updates. How many of you know what optimistic UI is? Optimistic UIs are based on the assumption that when the user clicks a button, the server should return a success response 97 or 99% of the cases. So we just assume we're going to make a request and it will return a success response. So based on this assumption, we can introduce this optimistic UI, which means less blocker UI for your application. So you won't be popping up large loading screens anymore. You can just go on, change your collection in the memory, and if there's something wrong, you can revert it. NGRX is good for that because we have the time traveling. So you can revert any action, basically. Optimistic updates with NGRX data is possible. So it has a configuration entity dispatcher options by default, providing default configuration for optimistic add and optimistic update. The default values are actually the safe ones, optimistic for delete and pessimistic for add and update. But you can override these choices in your actions and also in your application configuration here. So by using NGRX data library, you can also get the advantage of introducing optimistic updates to your application. But this is not the only library that you can use for optimistic updates. There's a really small runtime helper from Narwhal Technologies. So if you introduce this data persistence library from Narwhal Angular, they also introduce a nice way of handling the data, the race conditions, and also optimistic update for your collections. So if you provide undo action here, it makes a request to service layer, and if the request fails, it directly goes to undo action that reverts the action for the failed response. So you assume for 99 or 97% of the cases that you're going to have the success response. Then you will create instance experiences on the UI by directly changing the collection on your UI and waiting for the validation from the backend in the meantime. And this is all handled in this library, so you don't need to build this. By using this library, you will have it handled. And undo action is also customizable. You can just undo as you wish. Let's look ahead. Version 8 of NGRX not only introduced ngrx-data, but also it introduced creators, runtime checkers, and isolated tests. But before looking that ahead, let's talk about facades. Facades is a programming pattern in which a simpler public interface is provided to mask a composition of internal, more complex component usages. So you can use facade services to black box NGRX logic. So this is just an additional service. What we are doing with facades that we are moving the selector logic to the service layer. So in our components, we don't inject store anymore. We inject just facades, and facades are aware of how to deal with store, how to trigger actions, how to handle these actions through selectors. And you will be abstracting your component logic from NGRX. So your component doesn't really know if you're using NGRX or not. It just uses one observable. Facades can also be used as part of a paradigm shift from a standard Angular application to NGRX way of doing things. So if you haven't used NGRX yet, you can prepare your application for NGRX if you plan to do so, and starting with introducing facades. It's just, again, an abstraction. So you can make your calls to user service. You will be dealing with your good old Angular services, and you will be assigning the data that you get from service to these observables. And your components will not be handling data over services anymore. It will be dealing with facades, and it will be dealing with these observables. So these can be replaced with selectors eventually. So when you introduce NGRX, instead of introducing behavior subject here, you can introduce your selectors. And then you don't need to update anything in your component. Action creators are new. Earlier, we had to deal with a lot of scaffolding for creating actions, like creating action types, a class, and also action union. With the new approach, it's just one simple function. So you can introduce this function instead of creating an action type for it, creating a class for it, creating a union for it. So NGRX team wanted to really encourage the use of good action hygiene. So they had to come up with an easier way to create unique actions. It's also possible to use a function as a second parameter. This allows you to put logic inside the action creators. So this uses a function as a second parameter, and you can introduce your own logic. Create action is a factory function actually returning a function. So you need to execute that function like you used to create new instances of your classes. So instead of calling new an action class, instead we are just calling at foot here, which is just a function, our action function, but we need to execute it. They also created creators for reducers. So this is good old reducer. It has switch case. You need to deal with a lot of cases. By default, return the initial state. And with the new way of handling this, you can again call create reducer function, provide initial state. And instead of creating switch cases, you call these on functions. So you introduce your logic of your switch cases into these on function handlers, and you don't need to deal with the default case of your switch statement anymore. Similar to action and reducer creators, as an alternative to effect decorator, NGRX 8 provides this create effect function. The advantage of using this create effect is it is type safe. So if effect doesn't return an observable, you will get a compilation error. So just for this reason, it's wise to switch using these functions. So main takeaways for this talk: maintain a good action hygiene, use NGRX schematics, use selectors, attention to serialization and hydration, manage your data with NGRX entity or NGRX data, based on the scale of your application. Adjust your views with async pipe and change detection strategy on push. Use optimistic updates when needed, because we don't want to block our users, annoy them. Use facades where needed, and start using creators to reduce boilerplate. So these are the resources that I recommend. NGRX.io is the default documentation of NGRX, and this is a very nice example application. It lives in NGRX platform repository. Check it out. It has most of the ideas and patterns in this talk, so you can see actually a live application. You can clone it to your local, inspect it through your dev tools. And you might also want to check out how data persistence of narwhal is actually created. This is the source for it. And finally, these are the blogs that I recommend you to follow to keep updated with the NGRX world. Thank you.